Filtering in, yeah. Paul, one thing I was going to say, if you could take your badge off when you go on stage. Yeah, perfect. Sure. We got Jonathan. Oh, there he is. We got our name. All right. All right, we're going to kick. Do you need water? Do you guys need one? Paul? Okay. All right. Taking a picture from this perspective.
I'm thinking about things through two lenses. One is defending today, the second is securing tomorrow. How do we take care of today's risk and security threats to ensure that today we don't have issues, and then what does the future look like?
I do think that building a national strategy and bringing in some of the best capabilities within the private sector is probably the best way to deal with this permanent condition that will only get more intense. The digital sun will never set. It's just going to get hotter.
We're trying to change that mantra to enabling performance across the life cycle. And one of the key ways to do that is to start the cyber conversation earlier in the process so that people don't go through and think about building new things and deploying stuff, and then at the end go, oh yeah, and I need that ATO thing.
The government can be like industry. We can do things like industry. We can be agile. We can do DevOps. We can do cloud.
Over the years, and certainly over the last 3 or 4 years in the federal space, I've seen that cybersecurity folks realize that we had to change. We had to change the way we look at our business partners and not be a traffic cop, but actually be a risk broker and customize a strategy for you.
My team sits squarely in the deterrence by denial space. We look to work with the private sector to up the defenses. The problem is, when you live on a street of glass houses, yeah, we may have the biggest rocks, but we also have the biggest glass house. So how do we work with the private sector to make the house a little less glassy?
We have the FITARA scorecard. That focuses on FISMA. That's an incredible opportunity in and of itself to take, again, a more holistic view and bring in other communities to this conversation about cyber. So it's not just an IT thing, it's an everybody thing.
All right, welcome to the State of Cyber, CXO Tech Forum. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful July day. My name is Michael Hoffman. I'm the president of GovernmentCIO Media Research, and we're really excited to have you here. GovernmentCIO Media Research is the online destination for thought leadership and research focused on the transformation of government IT. Our experienced team collects the best practices and research regarding the advancing technology and management landscape. Hopefully you got to meet some of my team members, including the researchers and editors, during the breakfast this morning. We're extremely excited to have so many government and industry leaders connected to IT security join us this morning. And we're especially excited for the vast range of agencies who are going to join us for the different leadership. We have folks from the Department of Veterans Affairs, National Cancer Institute, FBI, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Patent and Trade Office, as well as the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services and SBA. So what a great group of folks who are really leading in IT and cybersecurity. The inspiration for this morning's event is the evolution of security in this data and digital dominated age. Last year, as you saw in the video, we were lucky enough to have Government Tom Ridge join us, and he talked about and described the constant threat of cyber attacks as a permanent condition that will only get more intense. Based on the past year with the different attacks and threats that exist out there, those comments truly ring true. So before we kick off with our first panel discussion, I wanted to make a few announcements. First, we're live streaming this morning's event, so hello to everybody who is watching, whether it be at their office or at home. We hope everybody who can be here or watching on live stream can be part of the conversation as well. So please, if you're on social media, please use the hashtag CXO Tech Forum. I also wanted to thank this morning's sponsors. We have BlackBerry Cylance, New Wave, Octo, and Grant Thornton. They all played an important role in terms of making this morning possible. So thank you very much. If we could get a round of applause for the sponsors, it would be a great start. Thank you. I also want to take a moment to recognize the charity for this morning's event. For every forum that we host, we always donate a portion of our ticket proceeds to a charity. This morning, we'll be donating a portion of today's ticket sales to the National Down Syndrome Society. The National Down Syndrome Society is a place that's really important to my heart, and I know a lot of different families out there are touched by Down syndrome. So we're excited to be a part of it and supporting that cause. So with that, I'd like to move on to our first panel discussion, the Protecting Point of Care Privacy. We're really excited to have the kick off with this one because we think some great leadership from the different agencies. So what I'd like to do now is invite some of the speakers, and we'll get kicked off. All right? All right, so to start, we'll have Jeff Schilling. He is the Chief Information Officer for the National Cancer Institute. Jeff manages the centrally provided IT for the National Cancer Institute enterprise, which includes server and endpoint hardware, COT software, network, and supports the NCI's scientific and administrative activities. We also have Paul Cunningham. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Paul is a retired Navy officer with a 22-year career, and he's also the former CISO for the Department of Energy. Finally, we have Jonathan Brett. Jonathan is the New Wave Director of Infrastructure and Cloud Architecture. Jonathan works with CMS, and he has an interesting background where he has a doctorate of law from the University of Baltimore. So let's get things kicked off. Thank you, guys. Let's take a seat. All right. So like I said in the opening remarks, data dominates the conversation in agencies right now. So we wanted to start with the Department of Veterans Affairs, New Wave, as well as the National Cancer Institute to kick off the morning to talk about protecting a lot of aspects of that data. So to start, I was hoping we could just go down the line. I started with a little bit of introduction, but if each one of you could talk a little bit about the programs and the agencies and maybe a few of the priorities that you guys are looking at right now. So I'll start with you, Jeff.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me this morning. The National Cancer Institute, or NCI, of course, we have to have an acronym, is really a research-based organization, so it does research and funds research. So unlike the VA, who actually sees patients, we always see clinical trial participants. And so we have, and our research goes from very basic understanding how biology works, chemistry works, radiology, to actually working with new technologies and direct clinical trial participant type work. So we also run, and one of the things I wanted to talk about today a little bit later is we run a cancer research registry, or cancer registry. In 1972, the government declared war on cancer, and as such, all cancer patients are centrally registered by the state, and then the federal government collects those registrations. So it's a kind of a non-HIPAA-based collection of data, very rare that we have today, and it's one of the things that we do a lot of work to keep that information private.
Paul.
Good morning, and thank you for your interest in coming out and having me here today. VA, I think everybody's knows a little bit about VA already, but there's some things you probably don't know. We are the second largest cabinet level agency, and if we were compared to a Fortune 500 company, we'd be in the top 10. And we are the largest healthcare provider. A lot of people don't look at it that way, but when you kind of think about it, it makes a lot of sense. But more importantly, we do a lot of other things, include financial benefits for our veterans that are coming back, and also other benefits that they need as a return, or they make their transition out from service to the country into the public and private workforce. So, and then of course memorials, and that's a very important thing. Personally, just recently, my grandparents were interned in a national cemetery per their request when he died. And what's interesting is my uncle, he was born in about 1950, I guess it was, and he died about 5 days after birth, and he was buried at that national cemetery, and that's why they wanted to be there. And so VA held the graves right beside my uncle for 60 plus years, right? Waiting for them to join him. So to me, that's the type of service as a veteran and as my grandparents were veterans. That matters, and that's what we have to kind of get back to and what we value. So VA is really about the veteran. And of course we do healthcare, we do financial, we do that memorial, but every day we walk in and we think, what can we do to provide better benefits for our veterans? And in that, we have a great opportunity to provide additional services to the federal government and the public sector, whether it's in research and development. For instance, we partner with Department of Energy, and we're using Millions Veterans, the Million Veteran Program, which I'm a member of, where we take our DNA and we take our medical records and we put them in high-speed computers at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and we're looking for those markers that say, hey, this is an indicator of whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder, cancer, tinnitus, diabetes, and right now researchers are going through this DNA data that's matched up to the best medical records in the world, really, to find those markers and to share those out to the community. So, the veterans are still out there serving even after they leave. They're right down I'm sure they're right down the street from you. They're on your neighborhoods. They're at your stores. They're delivering mail. And I just can't believe that I get to work at such a great organization that does so much and continues to serve the government and the country. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, Jonathan.
So New Wave is uniquely positioned on this panel. We're actually a federal government system integrator, mainly focused at CMS. We have $700 million plus prime contracts there. One of the largest projects that we have there is called the Chronic Condition Warehouse, which hosts claims data. Also unique to CMS, being the largest payer in the country, unlike the VA, which is mostly a provider, but also a payer. CMS mainly collects claims data, which to some degree is identified and also contains health information, but isn't quite as rich as medical records. A lot of times medical records are collected for purposes of audits and things like that, and New Wave also works and has a number of different contracts in that regard as well. But in terms of data privacy, New Wave is really at the heart of a lot of what CMS is doing, and CMS is really on the forefront, along with the VA, of kind of innovating on that. And I think New Wave as a company has really helped CMS both implement it and also kind of re-envision a way to provide health information to thousands and thousands of researchers across this country who are working diligently to solve some of the biggest problems that face our country and the world. And we can really think of that large-scale data sets. A lot of the health and conditions that we see, especially in managed care, a lot of the answers to that problem are in that data. And the real key is, how can we provide that data and also provide privacy and protection for the individuals who are being treated or whose care CMS is paying for?
Okay. Well, let me kick off with the first question here. I think it was interesting that Jeff and Paul were talking about, and Jonathan as well. Like I said, the vast data sets. You mentioned the Million Veterans Program. That really fascinating to see the level of data that's being collected as part of that, with just the amount of care that the veterans are having, as well as you connect that with the DNA. Just really gets to the heart of the matter that we're talking about. So, Jeff and Paul, if you could talk a little bit about how what is going into protecting those records, protecting that data as you guys go through the process there.
I think ours is maybe a little simpler because it's a little older. The method I wanted to mention, where we basically have as the data is collected, it's all identified, and then we use a service basically that we have that de-identifies that data and provides the de-identified data out to the public or to other researchers. But the data remains identified in this protected space, and that's not shared with anyone, so that we can do the long-term follow-up. And as more data becomes electronic, so initially we would get reports on this person has cancer, and then that would be it. We would have very little follow-up. But now that medical records are electronic, we can have that further follow-up. We can collect that information. There's not mandatory reporting requirements on that, but some of that data is available. We work with partners like CMS, and we work with the VA as well to try to get some of that information. And this basically this honest broker that keeps the identified information is the one that makes those connections. And we even have some work with either Kaiser Permanente or some of the pharmacy providers to basically be able to follow up and grab information to say these are the treatments that these patients are getting. So you would imagine that there's a giant kind of knowledge base over how people are treated, but there really isn't, because healthcare is fragmented among the providers, and with HIPAA, the protections are for patient privacy, so you can't just aggregate that data very easily. So I think at some point, if we look at how do we take advantage of all the compute and all the analytics, both retrospective and predictive analytics that we have capabilities today, we're going to have to address the kind of archaic or non-optimized laws and policies that we have, kind of restricting us and limiting us and making us work around them too much. So hopefully we can have some leadership vision to push the government forward in those spaces.
Okay. Paul?
So we look at it, we're kind of the same challenges when we came from very paper-focused medical records, now moving to electronic healthcare records and trying to incorporate all that paper, and how do we get that in a safe way. And I think that in itself is important, because when I got out of the military, I had to make a big copy of my medical record, 2 or 3 of them, and then have to move it to VA, and it sat on somebody's desk for a long period of time. And I kind of finally got my results back, right? So that's how it works. Now, as we move toward Cerner and having electronic healthcare records, we're actually using the same medical record that the Department of Defense is using. And then as they get closer, we start seeing that information 6 months out. And then when the retirement occurs, we actually have access to modify or add to those data points. So for the veteran, it becomes extremely easy. That's one-time event that I had to learn how to do. It took me a month of getting all my medical records and getting them seen and getting to the right person. Now it's going to be done automatically. That's our intent of what we want to be able to do for them. But it also increases the chance of better quality service, that they're getting a full medical record. Mm-hmm. And that the handling of that medical record as it goes from one base to another, I don't have to get my medical record put in the car, and hopefully the car doesn't get broken into. But that's the way we used to do it in the old days. So those sort of things, upon itself, by moving to electronic healthcare records, is increasing security. But just like everybody else, we are tied to federal requirements, HIPAA being one of them. But we also have the Senate looking over us. We have a lot of auditing going on. OMB is very interested in it. We see GAO and audits that are coming in, and it's a good thing. The more we can see, the more we can learn of where we are strong as well as where we're weak, and where can we go find other solutions to help us be better at it. And in a lot of ways, we kind of set that pace for the rest of the group. Now, as we move to Cerner, that's the big issue. This is a good chance for us to get that fresh whiteboard, sit down and do security right. I think a lot of times we inherit old legacy systems. We kind of have to bolt the security on and modify the security over years. Certainly that's been the way over the last 20 years with our medical records. So the amount of work that we're doing with the Department of Defense and partner with them and Cerner and even out with the public sector is very important, and that's one way we're finding ways to make sure that we have the right information to the right person, but we also do it not only quickly, but we do it in a secure manner. And I kind of compare it to a car. It's like the faster you go, the more that sudden impact's going to really hurt, right? So we can't necessarily go right into top speed. We got to work our way up to make sure that we're doing it in a nice, secure way, and then we'll, what's the next step, and how are we going to get faster and still be secure and protected.
Okay. Jonathan, Jeff brought up an issue with the policies and some of the legalities that have to go with it. With your background in law, did you have any comments on that in terms of how you see that evolution going?
Sure. So I think there's a number of different complexities here, right? With HIPAA, it's focused on protecting individual beneficiaries' data and allowing them to authorize that use. But then on the other side, in terms of research, there's a competing priority to say, especially from CMS's perspective as a payer, let's reduce long-term costs so that way we can increase the number of individuals covered under the federal programs. And so there's always that kind of competing priorities. At CMS, New Wave just began work with the Center of Innovation there, and a lot of what they're doing is focused on changing payment models from a fee-for-service to a managed care or an outcomes-based payment model. And those are always individual providers electing to do that. But in doing that, they also, of course, have to share individual medical records and information. And then that data is used to determine whether or not outcomes are improved. And that data, in many cases, is driven all the way down to the individual beneficiary level, because you have to actually follow that person throughout the treatment process. And so the complexity there is how do you maintain the privacy that is required by law, but nonetheless also try to move the system forward. And I think there are a lot of policies and regulations that need to change. I think CMS is really on the forefront of that with the draft regulation that's in the comment period now for the introduction or adoption of FHIR across the industry, which is an interoperability standard that's API-based and uses OAuth to provide authorization, and also is moving the industry away from sharing either large sums of data via file or paper, faxing things. And I think that's really critical to move the privacy conversation forward, because until we can really share not just among agencies, but also among providers and among payers, electronic information where we can revoke access when needed, we can ensure that data is being used according to the data use agreement that's been signed. I think that's really the key, and I think a lot of the technology is there and is being adopted, and I think the regulations will follow.
Okay, great. Paul, you mentioned the initiative with the electronic health record modernization support. What are some of the challenges? And you mentioned the partnership with the DoD to make that, the former veteran myself, I can understand. I went through that process and it didn't really make sense to me about like moving the records to the VA. I was like, why don't they just talk to each other? They're both in the government. So now it's going to make sense. I think you said something with a magical word. I think it will seem like magic to a lot of veterans out there. But could you talk about some of the challenges that come along with that, of working with the DoD on that partnership when it comes to a security piece there?
Certainly, I think just to a lot of degrees we're very similar to the Department of Defense, but we do have different missions, and we actually have different constituents. And certainly DoD, they're they're card-carrying members of the active duty. There's a lot of structure, and you can usually reach out and find them very easily. For veterans, we know where most of them are on a given time, but they're self-policing, right? We don't tell them what they can use, what tools they can use, where they can go. And certainly for a large constituent, some of them are maybe homeless or migratory in nature. And so if they're getting service in one clinic or hospital and they don't show up anymore, when they show up someplace else, we want to make sure that we can tie them back to the care that they received before and make sure they're getting the right care going forward. And again, it's that sort of more fluid constituents that we're looking at. We have constituents in Guam, for instance, that a lot of people don't really kind of think about, like, oh yeah, we still have to worry about the veterans that are maybe not living inside the continental United States or inside the United States as a whole. So those are some of the challenges. And then again, the Department of Defense has a very military optic, and they can control their networks in a certain way that we and VA need to complement, if not, kind of mirror up. And so there's some of the things we're working with. And it's, over the past year, and certainly the time that I've been at VA, there's this awareness of, we don't want to have meetings just for meeting's sake, but there's not been a meeting with the Department of Defense where I haven't learned a little bit more about DoD, and I was in the DoD for quite a while. Yeah. And likewise, I think it's the same thing. It's that understanding of this is a group solution that we got to come up to together, and we got to understand what our partners' responsibilities and requirements are, and make sure the solution meets that.
Okay. So Jeff, there's a lot of different ways that data is being collected, especially with the Internet of Things. I mean, everybody's got an app. Seems like everybody's got an Apple Watch nowadays, collecting it, or on their phones, what have you. How is that balanced when you guys were over at the National Cancer Research Institute? And when I say about that in terms of sharing with different researchers, sharing all this vast amount pools of data, what have you, and making sure it's getting into as many of the smartest researchers' hands to going after something as bold as curing cancer?
Well, I think the condition we're all faced with now is we have all this data. We know this data has a massive amount of knowledge in it, and trying to extract that is really the goal, right? So we know now that people are wearing these devices, like you mentioned, these wearables. All this information is there, but then how do we collect it and then ensure that we analyze it correctly? So generally, how research is done with protocols, human subject research protocols. So it's kind of a thing that if you wouldn't be very clear to you unless you were kind of in it. I know, because it was completely unclear to me until I started working on the clinical side, is that when a doctor treats you, the doctor treats you with the standard of care protocols, FDA approved ways to treat you, devices, drugs, procedures. And so you cannot deviate. There's some flexibility for the doctors, but there is very little deviation. And so in order to deviate or to try a new drug or to try a new treatment or try a new way to do things, you have to do a human subjects research protocol, and you have to get that approved by a local board, and you have to have kind of a scientific review of that as well to say, okay, this is going to make sense. You can't prove that point with 100 people. You have to get 10,000 people to prove that point. So really, that is the current model, and that model is just being expanded in this million veterans. Is that what it is? And then we have NIH has a product or big giant protocol called All of Us that anybody can join, and you then it tracks you for a long time over your life. It includes the wearables. So really, everything is done in these protocols, and then we also then are trying to drive it with policy to enforce data sharing, because you can imagine the scientists who work on these protocols, they spend many years getting them all ready and approved, and then that data is very precious to them. It's precious to their career. It's precious to their success, and so having to share that is a difficult procedure. So I think it's really the structure of moving from small research is really how research is done. It's done with hundreds of people, because not that many people are actually participating in trials, and now it's moving to millions of people. And so we are going to need a new paradigm for that, for how generations of upcoming scientists are going to be mining this data. They just are. They're not going to be maybe so worried about collecting it all, because they're going to be following not only these million participants, but the children of those million participants. How did that impact them that their parent had PTSD and was in a place where they had no health care? Well, that person is at a very much increased risk for these things happening, and we can then use that information to be more directly interventional, rather than that waiting for those children to come in or things like that. So this is only really the beginning of this digital change in how we understand how people work, and your health is your whole life. So that's the other thing. We have to track people for a long time to really kind of get an understanding of how are these things impacting them. So I guess I would say that for us, it's really making sure that we're very open-minded to, we have to have these old models that are very focused on patient protection, but we really have to be very open-minded around, there's a lot to be gained from these giant aggregate studies.
Okay. Jonathan, do you see something similar with that over at CMS, with the different layers that you see with the different amount of data that they're collecting there?
Sure. So CMS, there's a lot of complexities there because, of course, it's a federal system. You've got a huge portion of it that is state-run, and the government only has the ability to incentivize the states to do certain things with funding. And then on the federal side, you have, of course, Part A, B, and C. And then Part C is done through plans, through insurance companies, and people can elect to get into those, and their contract period. So first of all, the complexity is what kind of data is being collected from all of those programs. They all have different data sets being collected. And then on top of that, to change those data sets or to add data to that takes years, and from a state level may never happen. Because the government can't really force a state to do something. They can only pay them to do it. So I think that as we kind of move forward and CMS moves forward to enable things like artificial intelligence and machine learning on these data sets, there's a complexity to understanding the data, to linking up the data. We can think about problems of people moving from state to state, or trying to introduce like census data or HUD data to be able to enrich and kind of look at some of those problems, like individuals who live in rural communities, or individuals who live in cities, or different types of thing. When you start looking at how do I collect health data on these individuals so that way we can research this, it becomes very challenging, and to link that kind of information up. And then from a security perspective as well, all of these data sets have different regulations around them, different rules for use and authorization. And so I think that as we kind of look forward, and CMS just recently announced the Artificial Intelligence Challenge, mostly using claims data collected from the federal side, we can see that CMS is also trying to move that conversation forward and trying to propose new technologies and new ways of being able to do research, and also to provide kind of a laboratory of sorts for scientists to come in and be able to innovate.
So we have a couple minutes left. I was going to open it up for questions. Does anybody in the audience have a question for the panel? Yes, right back in the future dress. If you can use the microphone.
Great. Okay. Hi.
Yeah.
Ann Kokos. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, and this has been really fascinating. So I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your insights. So I have two questions, actually. So one is a general question for the panel, and a lot of you mentioned this kind of the challenge of balancing patient rights and these archaic HIPAA regulations with You can see where I'm going with this, with the challenge of aggregation. And I do research on US-China media and tech collaboration, so I recognize that in other markets, there might be much faster progression on these issues. But by the same token, one of the central benefits of policies like HIPAA is this type of kind of privacy regulation and patient protection. So I'm wondering, how does one kind of consider balancing these challenges while maintaining the kind of core rights and values of a really important principle like HIPAA? Now, my second question is specifically for Paul. So, as someone who's looked at, who's worked with people in the VA system, I know that there are challenges kind of linking up multiple security systems. So, I'll give you an example. One of my former colleagues was working in one of the VA systems and didn't get a security clearance while working as a physician fellow for 3 years. So during the entire time she was working as a fellow, she was logging in on other people's logins.
Didn't hear that.
Yeah.
What was the name of that person and where were they at?
No, but this was actually a chronic issue at that system because there were fellows coming from other countries who now in our current visa system were having difficulty getting clearances, which is a system that is very different from the types of security systems that you're trying to operate. So I understand the rationale for having like tight security, but then we also have these parallel systems operating. So the question is, how does one in your position balance these different priorities? Thank you very much. And again, thank you. This has been really fascinating.
Sure. I'll go ahead and kind of take the one there. I think that was pointed at me. Wasn't sure. Yeah. So she did. Yeah, she did. No, actually, that very scenario has been brought up, and we've talked about how do we make a risk-based decision in some of these kind of standard federal requirements, especially when we have to deal with people that are coming in under fellows or under internships that it may not be as easy as getting the security clearance that they need to get issued the right credentials. And really comes down to, are we making sure the right people have the right access to the right information and what they need and no more? And certainly it's a treasure trove of information, healthcare information in general. And then, of course, our constituents has a certain element to them as well. And we have to balance that with DoD requirements, because as you're also touching other federal organizations that include DoD. So to do that, we're looking at how can we segment off and start being able to do risk-based, behavioral-based operations on those that may not be able to get the background check that gives them full access, but to be able to start limiting access to only certain areas, so they wouldn't be able necessarily to collect a certain amount of data or have access to drop boxes, which they don't have now anyway. But my point is we're starting to look at where can we find the right mix and the right risk approach. So certainly that's been brought up. VHA has brought it up to the CIO. We're working at what's that right amount of confidence level that we need to ensure that the right person's getting it. I'd much rather watch somebody that maybe not have that full background check because we're not sure where they're coming from, and with the sort of confidence level we have with others. And maybe, like I say, we should be watching behavioral based anyway. And then from there, we start kind of locking it down based off the individual's behavior rather than logging on with somebody else's, because that's a whole nother. Once people start breaking rules, like laws like that, it really starts becoming a slippery slope on when they decide, okay, can they prescribe drugs or can they start doing these other things that we really don't want them to do as well. So.
Thanks. Okay. Jeff, do you want to attack maybe the first part of that question in terms of the balance?
Well, I really do, because I almost even want to call into question what you said about, this is very important. I don't think we really have the guiding principles on what we're trying to do around privacy. Like, what does that mean exactly, right? I should have those guiding principles, and then the laws should be able to address those guiding principles. And then when the laws are no longer addressing those guiding principles because of technology change or things like that, then we would change the laws. Instead, the law kind of becomes the principle, and that's not really accurate, because when a patient says, I don't care about my patient privacy. I'm dying at this point, and I would want to do all this. That's just not allowed. So the patient privacy isn't really respected. It's the law that's more respected. So I would say that's kind of what we really need. I'm pretty sure HIPAA was put in place as kind of a backstop because Congress couldn't really get to the point where what they really wanted. I don't think we need to go to something as complex as GDPR that Europe had to do. I mean, that was really much more of a social media and kind of a my daily life, and people are monetizing that information versus this healthcare thing, which is much more, I really don't want to be penalized if someone knows my information. Like if I'm found to have a genetic anomaly that causes me to have a heart condition, I don't want insurance to blackball me, right? Well, make that illegal. Don't allow that, but that's not, it says, oh no, you can't share data. So I was thinking as Paul was talking about, well, maybe, you know, I mean, maybe Jonathan could mention this because I don't know the law at all, mostly just from TV, you know. So I would say, you know, it's not legal for someone to get money. Someone who gets money illegally cannot keep that money, right? Those are ill-gotten gains. I think we should have ill-gotten data. If you have ill-gotten data, you cannot use that data. That is against the law. If you do not have the consent from the patient to say, you can have my information, then you can't use that information. If you're found to use that, that is penalizing, big time penalizing. Because as we start to aggregate all this data, it's gonna be impossible to tease these things apart. It'll be impossible to keep patient privacy. They won't even need privacy. They'll say, I'm taking a good guess that you have this anomaly because someone in your family does, and I can follow these traits, and you have blonde hair and blue eyes, and I'm gonna blackball you. That should be illegal. Instead, we kind of are gone to the doctors and said, you can't share that information. Like, that's the worst thing, right? Because doctors are about treating patients. Instead now, as we all know, we go to the doctor, what are they doing? They have their head down, typing in the computer, trying to get all this data right, making sure they don't make a mistake, penalized if they accidentally share data. Really, you're gonna penalize a doctor for accidentally sharing data to who? Generally another doctor. Why would anybody care of that? Why would you care about that? The thing is, it's not. They really don't want to mention that. These are the things we want to prevent, which is this this incorrect use of your information. And we really are at the beginning of this because, like you said, the data that's just collected from all your devices. We know we had an issue with all the runners were out there running, and they're like, oh, hey, you know, you're showing your exact track of where you're running every day to everybody in the world, and that's not very safe, right? We know that they knew where the Army bases were, they knew where certain things were. It's like, that's not very good. So there's a lot of, so rather than trying to stop it at the source, just stop the use you don't want to allow.
Yeah. Well, and now, I guess that Russian app, the Face app, everybody knows what they're going to look like 30 years from now. So we have that as well. All right, well, that's the time that we have now for this panel. Thank you guys for joining us and tackling this very important issue. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. All right. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Jeff. All right. Our second panel is going to be focused on securing America's IT infrastructure and supply chain. So what I'd like to do now is invite our next three panel speakers. We're going to have, just for a reminder for everyone, we're going to have a break after this panel discussion. So there'll be a chance to network, and we'll have each one of our speakers there available for that. So with that said, I'd like to first invite Wanda Jones-Heath to join me on the stage. Wanda is the Air Force Chief Information Security Officer. There, she leads a directorate responsible for developing Air Force cybersecurity strategy and policy for over 5,000 Air Force information technology systems. Next, I'd like to invite Adrian Monza. You can take a seat. Adrian Monza is the Chief of the Cyber Defense Branch at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. There, he leads a team responsible for security engineering, deploying and maintaining USCIS's security tools, penetration testing, and USCIS's secure coding practice. Thank you, Adrian. And then finally, we have Manny Castillo. Manny is the Senior IT Security Advisor for the FBI. He is responsible for leading the development and implementation of cybersecurity and defense practices for the global FBI enterprise. All right. He's also Manny also served as the NSA's Director of Operations from 2012 to 2018. All right. Well, thank you all three for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. So, like the first panel, I was wondering if we could kick off with, if you could just give a quick introduction about your role, your various roles. So I'll start with you, Wanda.
Okay, great. Thank you for the invite. So my role as the CISO for the Air Force, I'm responsible for all of the security for the IT, OT, which is ICS SCADA, as well as the security for weapon systems. I also have the fun task of privacy, records management, and some other compliance areas. So my focus is vast. I have a very small team, so I have to use a lot of partnerships with the functional communities to ensure that we are capturing all of the security concerns across the Air Force.
Okay. Thank you, Wanda.
As Michael mentioned, I'm the chief of the cyber defense branch, so I'm responsible for the technical aspects of cybersecurity at USCIS. My team regularly consults with all of our DevOps teams on how to maintain and deploy our systems securely. We're responsible for penetration testing. We do some development for security-related systems, and we also operate those systems.
Okay. Manny?
Good morning. Manny Castillo. I'm the Senior Information Security Leader for the FBI. My job is very simple. It's protect the FBI from cyber attacks. I'm actually responsible for creating the strategy, the implementation of procedures, and also technical means in order to protect the FBI. As you may know, the FBI has 56 field offices in the United States. We also have 363 smaller offices, and we do have a presence overseas at most of the embassies. So we have a really global digital footprint, that we have to defend.
Great. Well, as you can see from these three leaders' great experience and careers, we were excited to have all three of them talk about the topic and when it really came to IT infrastructure and supply chain. So I wanted to start with actually something that Adrian brought up during kind of our discussions ahead of time. He talked about within supply chain the susceptibilities and the risks around software development. A lot of people think of, when it comes to supply chain, hardware and some of the developments there, but I think it was interesting. So I'll let you kick off, Adrian, talk a little bit about what you brought up on software.
Yeah, so software supply chain is the thing that I'm actually really concerned about in terms of supply chain attacks. At USCIS, we're currently undergoing a very significant modernization as part of our e-processing initiative. So we're doing a lot of software development agency-wide. We've really been a leader in incorporating open source technologies. And as we're doing that, one of the challenge points, just looking at what's going on in the larger ecosystem, is the susceptibility of software supply chain attacks. We've seen that with things like FlatMap and Event Stream, a very well-known Node.js attack that occurred. Also another Node.js issue that occurred was the day that, I think the article was entitled "The Day That Left Tab Broke the Internet," for those of you who recall that. But those are, and we've seen these things occur in a number of different areas. Typically, more focused on financial type crimes, but I think it's only a matter of time before someone gets the bright idea and says, hey, this is a great way into government systems as well. And so focusing on identifying that supply chain and securing it is really a focus for us. We're not a organization that does a lot in IoT space. The infrastructure that we use is very much commodity IT, the same thing that everybody else uses from all of the same vendors. So we're going to leverage the work that Wanda and Manuel are doing for us on securing the physical supply chain. And really what we're focusing on is trying to secure that software supply chain of what modules are our developers using, what are those dependencies, and making sure that we know and understand that. So as there are vulnerabilities that are introduced, that we're able to track those and address those immediately.
Is there anything that you've seen, Manny, from that perspective, whether it be your time at the NSA or now over at the FBI?
Yeah, I mean, as far as supply chain, it's really nothing new to the FBI. And like you mentioned, I mean, you can have supply chain issues both on the hardware, software, But you got to look at supply chain from also, not only the goods that you're buying, but the services, right? Third party, now they call them, third party, your vendors. What is the risk when somebody's accessing your network? And the way the FBI looks at it should have to manage it. Just right, it's a risk. And what is the risk appetite for the organization? And one thing that I was thinking last night that I'm going through my unclassified brain is, two examples that have come up real quickly is, at least on the government side, is whether or not, the government can use Kaspersky software, Huawei, right? There was a presidential order signed by President Trump that basically said, for that is too much, right? In that network, we're not going to tolerate it for X, Y, Z reasons. So when it comes to software, the issue there is, if anything has a operating system, you can actually manipulate it, and that's where the problem is. Anything now from a watch, IoT, has some type of a operating system, usually Linux, and that can be, manipulated. It could also be just poor manufacturing and quality control. So that also comes into you think you have something, but you really have lower quality. So when it comes to, it's not only malicious, but just poor quality. So.
How about, speaking of software, Wanda, the U.S. Air Force has a really cool program called Kessel Run. When it comes to software and the development of it, when it's talking about security, have they been able to play a run? Actually, for those that aren't aware of the Kessel Run program, can you talk a little bit about what that's done for the Air Force from a security standpoint?
Yes, so Kessel Run is one of the innovation cells that the Air Force has recently stood up, maybe a year ago now. And what we did was we certified the infrastructure, and then we certified the process. So if we would just use that model and promulgate it across the Air Force, then you are secure. We use penetration testing. We use other innovative tools to ensure that we harden the infrastructure and then follow a direct process to ensure that you are developing, testing, all at the same time. And so we've had a lot of success. We have about 3 other opportunities that we're using to put that Kessel Run model into place. And it's producing a lot of good outputs. We're training folks. We have industry come there. We have our officers come as well. So far, so good. We've gotten a lot of new opportunity to see where we had some gaps and vulnerabilities and holes, and now we're closing them. So we're excited that we continue to use that model across the Air Force. The other services is also starting to take that model and move it across the Army and the Navy.
Okay. You meant, go ahead, Adrian.
But the really important question is will they have nearly as cool branding?
Well, we have one that has a really cool name. I don't know who comes up with the names, but it seems to be focused on Star Wars. So
it's the return to the 1980s.
Wanda, you mentioned penetration testing, and that was one of the things I wanted to ask about. For all 3 of you, how have your agencies tackled penetration testing, and what benefits have you seen for that? Maybe we'll start with you, Wanda.
Oh, okay, great. So one of the things that the CIO, my boss, Bill Marion, is very adamant about taking risk. He's not risk averse. He's trying to ensure that we are doing things smartly. The old ways are just not producing what we want to. We found that the paperwork, when you go through the traditional process of risk management, it's just not catching all of the vulnerabilities that we know are out there. So one of the things that we have instituted is using penetration testing to really find those bugs and vulnerabilities that are hiding, paperwork, check, done it, and you think you're secure. That's not true. We're using that. We've done bug bounties across the Air Force. We've done 1, 2, and 3. We found some very interesting situations where we had to go back and fix things. And now we're focusing on our programs. Our critical assets, we're starting with those first. If we can't modernize it, then perhaps we need to ensure that we are catching those vulnerabilities and closing those doors.
Okay. Adrian?
So USCIS has a number of penetration testers. I like to refer to them as my semi-tame hackers, and they actually work for my team. We've used them across quite a number of our systems, and I will tell you that the results that we've seen from that have been just illuminating. Things that in the paperwork it says, "Oh no, we don't do that. We fix that." Well, maybe we mostly fixed that. But really critically importantly, what it's done is it's given us a much better sense of what are the things that we need to focus on and where are the control areas that we really have weaknesses. We've discovered that I'll say that the results have been very, very helpful in again, looking at where we want to focus. There are definitely some things that we've seen there that we hadn't seen before, or that we hadn't thought of, ways of coming into a system that had never occurred to us, and it was that creativity that they brought. We've also used them in the IoT space with bringing in particular types of equipment. We've had our penetration testers look at it, and a couple of times we've actually identified serious vulnerabilities for the manufacturer, which we then worked with the manufacturer to responsibly disclose to them and retested, and they were resolved. So it's a good example of how penetration testing can really make you substantially more secure.
Great. How about you, Manny?
I mean, for the FBI, we handle everything internal as far as, our teams. I think it's useful, sometimes a little overhyped, and I'll tell you why. When I was detailed over to the National Security Agency, I was Director of Operations on the cybersecurity side, and that's where the red team resides. And we will have missions, and I was reading some of it, where we went to a DOD entity, and they did a blue and red. They went, find vulnerabilities, and then red team they're emulating an attacker. But then they're calling back 3 years later, and we do it again, and the things that were found 3 years prior to that never got fixed. So when you keep that in mind, if you're going to do it, fix it. Because one of the issues that I have seen in over 20 years, it's if you don't know what you have, if you don't know what you have in the machines, and you're not patching and fixing this, the vulnerabilities, you're really not doing a favor to organization. So it does have its place. Mm-hmm. You're trying to emulate an attacker, but an attacker may not do it the way you're doing it. But it's useful. It's a tool in your quiver. That's how I look at it.
Okay. Wanda, you mentioned bug bounties. Hack the Air Force has been a program that has been quite successful, at least whatever. Can you talk a little bit about how those came to be and how they might expand?
So it started in the DOD with Hack the Pentagon. And so once we saw the reports and saw the indicators, then the Air Force stood up and said we wanted to do the same thing. Unlike Adrian's approach, I don't have internal testers. And so we use the bug bounty model, crowdsourcing, to be able to use that particular capability. And we've done 1, 2, and 3 over the last probably 4 years. We found a lot of success. The trends, we know that we have some issues and we fixed those. And you mentioned about having the continuous monitoring. That's another piece that we are focused on, because we know that you fix it once, or you say you fix it. We want to make sure you do fix it. And so we do have a continuous monitoring capability that we are deploying across the Air Force down to the program level, to where we can now see. I actually have a dashboard for all of the capabilities, and I can see down to the program level through the portfolios of where we are, what is your security posture, what's your profile. So we are using those tools as well as bug bounties to be able to stay ahead of the adversary.
Okay. Have any of your, has the USCIS thought about it, or FBI using something like, because I know that was risky. When it came out the first time, I remember there was a lot of concern of, hey, we're going to open the kimono in some ways to do this and bring on these attacks. But it seems like, based on the prevalence of them and the expansion within the DoD, that they've seen success. But would the FBI consider something like that?
I mean, we have internal teams, so from the FBI perspective, we do it ourselves.
Yeah.
And that opens up as to, who is the company, how they're going to do it, protocols. So for us, it's really not an option because we have what we need. Okay. So.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Adrian.
It's certainly something that we're looking into. I know it's also something that I believe the department is looking into, so I think it's something that Paul might address later.
Okay. Well, that kind of is a segue into my next question, risk management. This is a topic that comes up quite a bit. What are some of the areas in risk management practices that your different agencies take place? Do you want to start, Manny?
Well, I mean, risk is, when you get on a plane, you're taking a risk that the plane may go down. So,
all right.
If the risk is like 90%, I'm not getting on the plane. But what you're counting on is that 99.9%. There's no issue. So, to me and to the FBI, it's a matter of how do you manage it. What is the appetite for the organization? It's all different. For, let's say, cyber operations, we may take a risk if we're trying to do a critical operation, where in some other cases we may avoid it or try to mitigate it. It's just something we have to manage. It doesn't go away. It's not zero. You definitely don't want 100%. But
okay, Adrian.
I'll echo a lot of what Manny has said. It is something that you have to manage. I think it's very important to take a holistic perspective on risk, and you have to balance what is the existing risk that you have by staying in the status quo. One of the things that we've seen is, as we're trying to modernize systems, is that we're pushing a lot of development in, and that's straining our ability to assess what's going on. So we've done similar to what Wanda has pioneered in trying to do a lot of investment into securing the process by which we develop systems. But then we have to assess, okay, what is our ability to identify what the risk is, but also what is the risk that's already inherent in some of these legacy systems? We know what the risks are with some of those legacy systems, and just by moving to a more modern code base, by moving to modern development practices, that inherently is going to help us buy down a lot of risk. So I think it's important to also look at what's the risk of what you have, not just what's the risk of what you're moving to.
Okay. Wanda?
So one of the things that I'm working on is a risk management strategy. Part of that strategy is three things that we've already talked about. Cyber hygiene. That's something that if you do that, that's 80% of the problem. We went across the Air Force. We have a scorecard. We track the metrics. So I kind of know the security posture of most of the assets in the inventory. The next thing we look at is some type of penetration testing. If you do that, and I can see what your vulnerabilities are, then you get a check mark. And then the last piece is continuous monitoring. So if I can see where you are now, where you're going, and then do a snapshot over time, then I deem you secure. Absent doing all of the paperwork. If you do those three keys, then that's the model we're using unless you are a legacy system. And then you have to go through the complete risk management framework approach. One of the things that we are looking at as well is when it comes to weapon systems, when it comes to operational technology, there's not a one-size-fits-all. So you kind of have to have various strategies where you can meet the program or the system where they are. No more can I go and stop a production. I can't be the doom and gloom of no. So I'm looking more of being a partner, working with our financial community as they're going through their audits right now to ensure that they're doing the right things based on their mission. So the first thing I look at is what is the mission impact? And then I look at security. What can I do to help raise your security posture as we move forward, or either modernize your application or system?
Great. We have a couple minutes left. Were there any questions in the audience? Over here on the left. Can you wait for the microphone for the live stream audience?
Thank you all for being here. I just had a quick question in regards to these legacy systems and coming from the Army and facing our audit head on and strong. My question is, when facing these legacy systems and wanting to develop further, wanting to meet the security threats that are out there, where they are. What are you seeing in terms of the threat that browned out systems continue to have? I think I'm trying to better understand. We want to move forward, we want to implement new systems, but as anyone in DoD knows, no system's ever shut down, blacked out. The information is still there in a browned out system because we continue to keep eyes and maintain. So I'm wondering, as that continues to expand, we start new systems, we implement new programs, and you have to protect more things. How are you expanding along the way? What are your expectations in that?
Okay.
So one of the things is you have to meet the program where they are. When those legacy systems were developed, security was nowhere around. Nor do they want them around. So one of the things that we do is when we do assessment on a legacy system, we try to figure out what can we fix. You can't fix everything due to money and resources, and that system still has to operate. So understand the risk posture of that system is part of the starting point. And then you lay on whatever security procedures or tools you can. Sometimes you can't do anything. And so you have to just understand what the security is, and then you go and look at the threats. If the threat and if the intel threat doesn't give you a picture of it's being attacked or anything like that, then you just monitor it and make sure that as patches are come out, then they patch. They keep updated software if they can, and so you just kind of have to look at that and put it in a bin to make sure you watch it. Sometimes that's the only thing you can do.
Adrian?
At USCIS, we have a little bit of a different perspective. Our perspective is more along the lines of the job's not done until the old system is unplugged. One of the most exciting days that I've had in my career was the day that a 40-pound cardboard box arrived from our data center. And the box contained the shredded remnants of the hard drive disk array from our mainframe. Our we opened it up. It was better than Amazon Prime Day. I'm sorry. It was. I mean, we were that excited. I've never seen my CISO with his eyes lit up like that. And he actually he lugged the box himself into our CIO's office, and they opened it together. And they were going to shred it again and put it into mason jars and give them away as keepsakes. Because just as but it was and he keeps it in still. The box is still in our CIO's office, to my knowledge, and he keeps it there as a reminder that you can't just keep having browned out systems left on your network, that there's still vulnerabilities. As you modernize the critical pieces, you have to finish the job. You have to turn the old systems off. And it requires a mindset change. And I've seen that at USCIS. I've worked there in and around there as a contractor and federal employee for about 10 years now. And I saw that when I started work there, we had very much the same mindset where we would create the new system, but the old system would never really go away. And we had systems that were 30 years old on the mainframe. We hadn't done a case in them for over 20 years. And we looked into them, they still had 10 active cases, and we just never pulled the plug to move 10 active cases. 10 active cases was a couple of hours of data entry, and then we could turn the system off. And that required just a mindset shift. And once we started with that okay, Dr. Seuss, I'm not even going to try anymore. Anyway, once we got there, then we started realizing, okay, we got to shut it off. And then we've been much more productive in our modernization since.
I want that.
That was something.
It's not easy. I will say that it's really not easy.
My Achilles heel.
Wonderful. Manny, do you have anything?
Just a couple of things. I mean, the FBI, it sort of operates like a Fortune 100 company. It wouldn't be any different than, some big company. So what do you do with mainframes and all that, which we don't have anymore, or they're hiding? But you got to have a plan in place. So you have this, and you go into this particular technology. How do you phase it out? As far as, our critical systems, they're not internet phase. They classify, so that gives me a little bit more of a buffer. So, what is the system? What type of information is in it? Because I'm always concerned, how is an attacker going to get to it, right? Is he just going to go straight out internet, or he's going to have to come up and do some trickery? So it's a matter of knowing what you have, how you're going to deal with it, what kind of extra protection you're going to put into it until you replace it or you phase it out. So it's all a balancing act.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time we have for our panel discussion here. Thank you to all three of you for joining us and sharing your thoughts on it. All right, thank you very much. All right, so what we're going to do next is we're going to take a 10-minute break. There's a bathroom back there. The coffee, food as well is available. But if everybody could get back, we're going to kick off with Ms. Manfra for our keynote fireside chat. So you don't want to miss any of that. Talk to you soon. All right. Okay. Could everybody find a seat? We're going to kick off here with Jeanette. So about one to 2 more minutes. So if everybody could grab their seat, and we're going to get started. Nobody has their name badge? No name badges? Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for returning for our second half of the show. I'm really excited to have Ms. Manfra, Jeanette Manfra. We were lucky enough to have Chris Krebs from CISA from DHS last year. So we're very excited to have Jeanette as well join us. So I'm going to hand it off to Amy Kluber, who is our managing editor, to formally introduce Jeanette, and we'll take it from there. Okay? Thank you.
So I'm with Jeanette Manfra, as you know. She is the Assistant Director for Cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And that's just a long way of saying that she leads DHS's mission of protecting and strengthening the nation's critical infrastructure from cyber threats. So, with CISA being such a new agency, as we know, it was stood up formally in 2018. Of course, there was a backstory to that with the previous agency. Explain what CISA's mission is and where its positioning fits into government.
Sure. So I see a lot of familiar faces, so some of you may already be familiar with the organization, but I'll just do a quick history. So as you mentioned, I lead the cybersecurity division, and in November of last year, Congress passed a law to stand up the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We wanted people to make sure we're really focused on security, so we got in there twice. And the concept behind it, in addition with the law, was also internal to DHS, was establishing us as an operational component. So sort of on the same footing as FEMA, CIS, who you heard from before, and not as a headquarters agency. A lot of that has to do with sort of internal bureaucracy on how you manage things. Those of you who work in the federal government, I'm sure, can appreciate that. So the sort of parts of the organization, though, have really been around since the stand-up of the department after 9/11. And it was actually focused on addressing, in particular, some of the issues that had started some policymaking in the Clinton administration, actually, always thinking about how does the government partner with critical infrastructure to share intelligence back and forth about threats to critical infrastructure. It was primarily focused on physical threats to critical infrastructure, but even back then there was the notion of internet security associated with that. When the department was stood up, there's part of the 9/11 Commission, a variety of other reporting around that and thinking through what happened. A key part of that was that there was no clear mechanism and clear authorities on who and how the government would partner with critical infrastructure, that if we have intelligence that would prevent an attack, and how do we get that to them? Also, how do we focus on building more resilience and more ability to prevent those attacks from happening? So the organization was actually stood up in response to largely a counterterrorism issue, and we still maintain that mission. I have a peer division within our organization on the infrastructure security side that focuses on physical security threats, all hazards, really threats to critical infrastructure, and they focus now currently on things like soft target security, school safety. As the threat landscape evolves, how do we partner with entities that have some threat, both again on the prevention side to raise the bar of security, and ideally prevent something from happening, but also to build resilience and to be able to mitigate those consequences. Over the years, as the cyber threat evolved and as our mission expanded, in particular with regards to federal cybersecurity, and our responsibilities expanded with regards to how we deploy tools and guidance and now directives to other federal agencies, the predecessor of our organization established a new independent sort of cybersecurity component. So, but it still follows all of those same principles. We enable others to do better better security, whether that's physical security or cybersecurity. We enable others in our emergency communications division to do better public safety communications and interoperability to respond and restore communications after a disaster. But I will not go too much further into that, but that's sort of generally how we're organized in the new agency with these three primary divisions: the cybersecurity division, the emergency communications, and the My division, which is the cybersecurity. I will touch on branding a little bit because this gets very confusing. People are like, well, what about US CERT, ICS CERT, NCIC? We're all the same. They're all in my organization. I will acknowledge that we could probably do with some help on some marketing and branding to make it a little bit clearer. US CERT has been around for a very long time. ICS CERT, very long time. NCIC, about 10 years. These are the operational entities within my organization that focus on sort of things like publications of best practices, technical advisories, our incident response capability. All of those exist and are not changing. Ideally, we're making them better, but those are all part of the same organization within CISA.
Would you say CISA is filling a gap in government?
I think it's filling a gap in government. I think it's more broadly filling a gap in the national and recently we're learning really in the global stage. And so I'll focus on federal cybersecurity first because this is a very confusing space for a lot of people who don't do it a lot as to what are roles and responsibilities in federal cybersecurity. And this is in law. At a high level, every agency, just like every company, is responsible for their own cybersecurity. They know their networks, their systems, their functions best. They're responsible for and accountable for that. And then of OMB, the Office of the CIO, that's responsible for issuing policies that we want to have all agencies achieve. Over the years, the role of DHS has evolved, and we sort of sit in the middle and really partnering with the Department of Commerce, National Institute of Standards and Technology, where they're setting the standards. And what we realized the gap was, and we had understood this before, but OPM really highlighted this, was that we weren't really thinking of all the civilian agencies. There are 99 civilian agencies. I would like to see if anybody can riddle them off, but they are, there's all the big ones that everybody knows. And then there's about 75 very medium to small agencies. We're responsible for working with all of them. And so what we realized, again, it was before OPM, but then kind of thinking about sort of how did this happen? There's a variety of things, and we don't have to go into all the details. There's been a lot of thinking about all of that. But we weren't really thinking of all of these civilian agencies as an enterprise. And particularly when you think about shared services and where you have information that one agency is allowing another agency to host, risk management transfer and decisions that were happening that weren't really being thought through, as well as the sort of increasing connectedness of our agencies' IT infrastructure, where you would have the target agency maybe that an adversary was trying to get to maybe wouldn't be the first attempt to get in. It would be through some other agency where they were working through to eventually get to that data that they were seeking. And so that's where I see DHS really filling on federal cybersecurity, is understanding and helping to manage enterprise risk across all civilian agencies. We were also given a few unique authorities to both procure, we're appropriated and authorized to procure tools and capabilities that we can then deploy out to federal agencies through our continuous diagnostics and mitigation program. So now and this is still a voluntary program, and people can choose not to participate, but most choose to participate. But it allows us to standardize those tools. It allows us to reduce costs, because now we're getting the entire purchasing power of all federal agencies coming together. And it also allows insight and data to not only roll up to that department head CISO and SOC, but also at a kind of at a more abstracted level coming back to DHS. And so it's really giving us tremendous more insight into what is happening across agency networks, both just sort of common vulnerability exposure issues, but also threats and tactics that are targeting multiple agencies. And so it's allowing us to take that broader picture. And then we were also given authority to issue something called binding operational directives. And And so we thought long and hard about how we issue these sorts of directives, and we decided that what we wanted to focus on is something that is a representation of an enterprise risk, something that's not just specific to a couple of agencies. If it's that, then we just work with those couple of agencies. But really thinking about, is there an area that is either it's a common area where people are not prioritizing it for whatever reason, usually resources, but that's commonly exploited, or an area where we're seeing maybe it's a common software tool that some people are using that we know an actor could exploit. So using that authority and thinking about that in the first case, but then also an ability to independently measure compliance with that directive. So we've since issued all of these directives publicly. You can find them at cyber.dhs.gov. We've also found that the authority is very useful in driving better practices beyond the federal government. So as a result of some of these directives, and for those of you who are in federal agencies and have to implement them, they're doing a phenomenal job in implementing these directives and taking the federal government in many cases as being the sort of the laggards in industry on certain security practices to actually leading. And in our email and web security, people tend to refer to as the DMARC one, but there's actually a lot more in it than DMARC. But we went from where an independent auditor said federal government websites were on average least secure out of all industries to just a couple of months ago, we are now leading all industries in the security of our websites. And that is just through, thank you, I feel pretty proud of it. And that is, again, it's not just DHS. We're not doing it for them. We work together. We figure out what are these things that we want to do together, and then the agencies implement. Their vendors have to work with them to implement, and in some cases, we did have some challenges there. In a couple of cases, we had vendors that said, well, you know what, I'm not just going to do it for the federal government. I've got to do it for my entire consumer base. So now every global customer of that vendor is now benefiting from a higher level of security through these actions. So we try to be very focused on, enterprise risk. How can we take actions? How can they be tangible, doable actions, not just sort of things that are pie in the sky, very complicated and resource intensive. I'd love everybody to get rid of Windows XP, but that's going to be a longer conversation. So what are the things that we can do? We've also implemented something called high-value assets, which is really thinking, and again, this goes back to OPM, is while we're thinking about this broad enterprise risk, we also have to really think about what's the most important assets that we have, both important from a high-value target, an adversary would be interested in it, but also important for either it has a lot of PII, or it's critical to the functioning of some system that we provide to American citizens, travelers, residents, et cetera. So we've been working on this for a few years. I've made a lot of progress, and it's really highlighted, I think, an evolution of how we think about using our compliance framework, which is FISMA, to think in a risk management way. And so not just sort of having a system owner go through and say, okay, here's high, low, whatever it is, but really getting mission and system owners talking together about the true impact of somebody taking this information or messing with the integrity of it. And that also allows agencies to prioritize what they focus on with their limited resources. And many of them have very limited resources to be able to focus on this. So we sort of translated then all of that into thinking about the critical infrastructure, which I think is the other gap that we fill, in that we have for a long time, we've worked with critical infrastructure, we have structures in how we share information, how we talk about policies, and we have kind of unique authorities to have non-public conversation, trusted conversations, both at a technical level and also at a policy level. But what we realized we were missing is nobody really had a solid picture on what does national risk look like, and what are functions. We have the industries, and you can read sort of all the 16 sectors, and it was a very industry vertical approach that made sense when it was developed a decade ago, and really does still serve a very, very valuable purpose. You still need to have some industry-specific conversations. But particularly for cyber, though we're approaching it for all hazards, we were missing connectivity. We were missing with the conversation about the fact that you've got big banks over here, and they have a niche set of IT service providers that are not in the conversation. But we should be talking to them, and we should understand who they are so that our intelligence community could be looking out for threats to those assets. So last year, we stood up the National Risk Management Center to fill this gap. And then we worked with industry and experts in government and established what we released I believe it was in April, a set of national critical functions. And this is really a first step to say, it's, again, like we're talking about in the high value assets in the federal side, but looking sort of across the country, saying, what are we most concerned about being disrupted? Either the function going away or disrupted in some way, like electricity, sort of the DNS system. There's sort of a variety of, we've got about 55 functions that is public. You can look at those. Or where we lose trust and confidence in that system. A lot of our systems in our economy and in sort of allied economies, they're based off of trust. And these are not largely government-run systems. They're based off of public confidence that the system is working, that the data is not just secure, but also has integrity. And increasingly, many of them are very dependent on some sort of, I'll use the term cyber system kind of very broadly, not that they're connected to the public internet. So that's the gap that we're filling on the critical infrastructure side. And again, it also then prioritizes, what do we really care about? And where does the federal government really need to get involved? Again, every company is responsible, whether you're a state and local entity or a private sector company, you're responsible for your own cybersecurity. But because of the connectedness and because of the potential for national risk, we want to understand those consequences, and we want to focus on both preventing something from happening, which means more targeted information sharing, back and forth. The government is not the sole holder of all good information, but also thinking about contingency planning. How do we prepare for if we can't prevent something, that we're ready to respond? So those are, that's a very long answer, but those are sort of the gaps that we see filling on both of those spaces.
Well, let's jump back a little bit into when you mentioned modernization of technology. In today's landscape, just like in the commercial world and our private lives, technology commonly is used to make things more convenient or easier for us, reduces administrative burden. But sometimes with that convenience, it poses security risks, especially if you're quickly modernizing. So how can government find the right balance? What will that take?
I wouldn't accuse anybody of government of quickly modernizing. So I think we're taking a measured approach. I think that for us in government, when we talk about modernization, there is the element of getting rid of the legacy systems. I love the CIS story of getting rid of that mainframe. And that's really important, but we're trying to talk about it broader, is also modernizing our policies, our acquisition system. Talked about supply chain before. Lowest price technically acceptable, probably not the most secure solutions that you're going to get. And so how do we modernize, again, not just the systems themselves, which is very important, but I will say, there's massive trade-offs, and if there's ways that you can look at mitigating potentially some of those issues with a legacy system, and you can apply those resources in a different way, I think that's a conversation you can have. I'd love if everybody had the money to replace all those systems. But there's a lot more to modernization. There's, our Trusted Internet Connection program that we're modernizing, what we call the TIC 3.0, to account for the ability to enable better cloud adoption. We call it Cloud Smart, and so sort of thinking about how do you adopt some of these new technologies, but do it in a smart way that balances, like you said, balances the need for efficiency. Government spends a tremendous amount of money on IT operations and maintenance, again, largely for these legacy systems, but we tend to like to build these sort of proprietary configured systems that cost us a lot of money to operate and maintain, regardless of whether they're legacy or not. So I think there's a lot of benefit to outsourcing that to others who have more incentive to recapitalize those investments without us having to beg Congress for that money. There's other security policies. I think TIC is one example, but just even in thinking of like FISMA, of how do we modernize, how we think about using that that sort of compliance system as a risk-based approach that requires modernizing the way inspectors general think about their audits of federal agencies and the choices that they make. So that's how we broadly think that there's more to modernization than just the technology itself. We also think we have to modernize and I'll use the architecture in quote because there is no like actual federal architecture. There's kind of notional architectures, if you will, and some reference architectures, but I think there really actually should be one. There should be sort of some commonality. There should be, I'd love to get rid of the idea that if I want to email somebody in the Department of Commerce, that has to go to the public internet before it goes to them. Seems like we could probably do some things different there. So we're trying to think about all of those things in terms of modernization and really get the entire community, and it's generally not the security, well I will say, it's generally not that CISO sort of community that doesn't think in a risk-based approach. It's often the auditors, it's the folks doing the ATOs that want to spend, a year and a half and you're on POAMs forever and all that. So but trying to get everybody to think about what do we really care about, which is really these high-value assets. How do we prioritize resources? How do we take actions to make ourselves overall more secure? And how do we become more sort of flexible and resilient as a government? But we have to be able to make choices. The one thing you always hear is when a CIO, they're going to get yelled at when the email system is down. Like that's what they're going to get yelled at for. They will get yelled at eventually if a breach happens, but the daily sort of like churn is going to be, why is my email down and why can't I access the internet? I've largely given up accessing the internet at DHS, but we are really, really secure. Paul, don't tell John I said that. But like and that's fine. I mean, we've made those choices. We are a security agency. We have a lot of people targeting our systems, and so we've made the choices to sort of have a higher level of security, which does, degrade some on the user and some of the efficiency side. But those are the choices that we've made, and I believe that they're the right choices. Other people may make different choices, but I just sort of keep trying to encourage federal agencies, private sector. It has to be a conversation between the security people, the engineers, and the mission people, the ones who actually are going to own that mission. It can't be security people trying to make decisions elsewhere. In one part, engineers developing the system in one side, and then the mission people oversight going, well, this isn't what I need at all. And so we try to get all of those folks together to have that conversation.
There's all kinds of ever-revolving technologies that we hear about all the time, like 5G. Mm-hmm. There's also security risks that are present in, for example, our elections that we hear about. How can our nation employ entities like CISA or work with CISA to stay at the forefront of some of these things?
Yeah, just like 5G and elections, two small things. I think that. Well, it depends. 5G is an emerging sort of technology, or really set of standards and architecture that the value that we provide in some of those areas, particularly when you start to get in very complicated ecosystems, that is hard for people who are policymakers, either on the Hill or in government or even just sort of partner countries. It can be hard to, if you're not in that space, and it's very complicated from both the market ecosystem and the technological ecosystem to understand that and to have a balanced conversation about what risk actually is. Risk, a lot of times people say equals threat, but it actually doesn't. It's risk, vulnerability, and consequence. And so we try to focus on all of those and understand the threat, yes, but is there a vulnerability that threat can exploit to have a significant consequence? And you have to have all of those pieces, I think, and that's where we try to come in. And so for 5G, really talking with the companies in the, that are in that market, both U.S. and others. And first is understanding what is the reality of the technology behind it, really getting deep into sitting with the engineers and our engineers and really understanding that to a level of technical depth that we can have a good conversation about it. I think oftentimes policy conversations are had without technical knowledge, and at the same time you have technical conversations without policy input, so you can diverge pretty quickly and in many cases make uninformed decisions on either side. So 5G being an example, but there's many other cases where we do this. You say you have, you've got Black Hat and DEF CON and others coming up, have people announcing, I can do this, and everybody starts freaking out. And so you kind of work with the researcher and work with the company and really say, well, what actually is happening here? What is the potential for significant consequences? And so we try to inform people. Sometimes we do it through documentation in elections. We released a public risk characterization of elections so people could understand everything from the voting registration databases to when you're at the polls, the machines are different, that you're on are different than the actual election management systems. The former not connected to the internet, the latter maybe, but it's more of your typical IT back-end software system for managing their elections. So helping people understand, doing it in a way that is not sort of overwhelming to a non-technical audience, but really saying, so here's what the ecosystem looks like. Here's some potential risk. Again, if you talk about supply chain, all of you here are probably more experts, but the average person doesn't understand, supply chain risk management life cycle goes from all the way from thinking about procuring something to the final destruction. And then an actor could exploit it in any one of those areas. And so helping people understand those sorts of things has proven really useful, I think, to help policymakers understand it and say, okay, all right, well, here's sort of then our options for dealing with this aspect of the risk. We've also been more open than I think we have in the past in working with industry and getting their input on what they think the reality of the risk is as well. And I think we've learned a lot of useful information that we may not have understood had we just done it as the government. And I think that kind of gets into sort of the last piece about working with us is the partnership. We, at my organization, there's one aspect of my a different part of CISA that does have some regulatory authorities for chemical facilities, but for the large part, we're not a regulatory agency. We're not law enforcement. We cannot compel people to give us information. And so we have to really provide value and help people understand why it makes sense, why there's value to them, and in partnering with us and providing information. And so we've done a lot of sort of listening over the last couple of years and helping to understand, well, where are there some gaps? What could we be providing you that would be better? The National Critical Functions was a result of these, understanding what information would be useful to you at both a strategic level and a technical level to better defend if you're managing one of these critical functions. Those are the kinds of things I think elections and 5G have both illustrated in specific cases how we've been able to work with a community to take very, very contentious issues and find ways to work together and to understand both sides, but they're also illustrative of how we can do that in other areas as well.
So we're down to our last minute. I want to open it up to the audience to see if anyone had any questions from their point of view.
Thanks for being here. So you mentioned that part of the gap you want to fill is creating those contingency plans. And I know that in the past you have talked about it perhaps being necessary, and Karen Evans from the Department of Energy mentioned this in recent congressional testimony as well, that it may be necessary to adjust the regulatory framework in cases of emergency response. Can you give us a better sense of what is needed in terms of regulatory changes getting rid of some regulations to ease the flow of information? Maybe it's something else. But what do you see is needed on the regulatory front there?
I don't think there's any conclusions yet about what would be needed on a regulatory side. I will say generally, in not all industries, I think things need to be streamlined. I think in some cases you're getting, and this happened, I think, in the federal government, you get a bit more of a checklist-oriented approach. We want a risk-based approach. And with, technology that moves fast, and you want to be able to enable, like we talked about before, both operational efficiencies, as well as ensuring diligence around security. The way that I think about it is if you take a function-based approach and you start thinking about scenarios where if somebody were to disrupt, and both malicious and non-malicious, we're looking for just if it's disrupted or you lose some integrity in the data, who would be best positioned to take action? And the answer is usually a mix of government and industry, and it's not even just that industry. Oftentimes for cyber, you're going to get the sort of players in the broad ICT ecosystem that will be best positioned to take action. And so the conversation that we're starting to have is, if you work through just a couple of scenarios, I don't want to do it ad nauseum, try to do every single scenario, but work through a couple of scenarios, and you get to a point where a company would say, I could do this, and everybody agrees that that would be awesome. They say, but I'm not going to do this because of the potential for liability or the potential for, regulatory and for a variety of things, and I'm just making these up. We haven't had these conversations yet. We might want to look at, are there legal or policy changes we might want to make? Now, we may decide, well, no, actually, there's a reason you're not allowed to do that, and everybody agrees that that's the right thing to do, so let's find an alternative to kind of achieve that effect without causing that. But you could imagine scenarios where if, I won't call out names, but say you have a large system provider that a lot of people use, and they have global sort of presence, and they are best positioned to stop an attack exploiting their system. And we ask them to take some action. Is that right now we don't really have that level of detail. We have a high-level national cyber incident response plan. We have something that was done in the last administration called it's a Presidential Directive 41 about cyber incident response doctrine. So we have these high-level kind of doctrinal approaches. But what I sort of liken it to is both if you think about kind of what happened after World War II in thinking about protecting the United States and sort of how kind of nuclear and all of that sort of evolved. That analogy doesn't go too far, but it does in sort of how the government had to think through that. I think even more applicable is thinking about how we had to defend our airspace after 9/11, and we had to think very differently, and you had to bring civil aviation, airlines, government, regulators, you had to bring everybody together to really think about what does it mean to have domain awareness in our airspace, how do we know what thresholds and who's going to do what to whom. I would say this is even more complicated than all of that, and that's why we want to sort of focus on different functions. But that's I don't necessarily know that we may go through this whole exercise and everybody say, nope, all of the policies and the laws, those are right, but we just need to operationally document who's going to do what. And I have a feeling what will probably happen is there'll be a couple of scenarios where we'll say it would be awesome if we could collectively do this, or on behalf of the government, an entity could do something. And to be clear, I'm not talking about hackback or any of those things. I'm talking about truly, mitigating a response. But there would be a policy challenge that we'd want to work through. So we're trying to push the bounds even within government. You see us and DoD doing a lot more forward-leaning work together, trying to think about how we complement our authorities, bringing regulatory agencies more into the fold to understand how can they sort of be a part of this conversation. But that's sort of how I would characterize and how Karen and I and others are sort of thinking about it. But we don't want to make any conclusions until we go through a more deliberate process of understanding what would be the benefit of changing any regime that we have right now.
All right, we are all out of time, but thank you so much for your perspectives. I'll hand it off to Mike, and maybe she'll be able to hang around for questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you, Amy. All right, the next I'm going to invite to the stage for our industry perspective. I'm going to invite Adam Palmer, who is one of our business development directors with GovernmentCIO Media Research, as well as John McClurg. John is the vice president and ambassador at large at the Office of Security and Trust for BlackBerry Silence. So if I could have the two of you join me up front, and we will kick off there. All right, great. So, just take those two.
Testing. There we go.
Okay, we're on. All right, John. Well, I'm really excited to have John with us today. I've had the pleasure of spending the last hour with John talking about very interesting things. Typically at GovernmentCIO, we start meetings off with fun facts. So, John, I'm going to give one of your fun facts out here.
We'll see if it's fun.
Yeah. It's fun. John once learned Polish.
Oczywiście. Ja mówię po polsku, tak jak Polakiem.
Yes. And as a result of that, took out the only remaining Polish spy after he had dinner with him and his wife. That is fascinating and a fun fact.
Took out is kind of a vague and ambiguous phrase.
I'm making it exciting.
He was repatriated home.
John, this is my story now. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to start off by talking espionage. John has a very interesting background on how he got involved with three-letter agencies. And then we're going to shift into the conversation of cyber, is typically looked at as a reactionary thing, right? Something happens and then we react to it. And I think one of the most fascinating things about John's work is pulling cyber into a space where it can be proactive. And so I want to end kind of in that vein. So I'm going to do my best to give John's background just to catch you up to speed on John's 30, 40 career. So John, correct me where I misstep, and then we're gonna get into some espionage here. Okay. So picture this: John is in college. He's studying hermeneutics. How many people know what hermeneutics is? Okay, we got two, three people. That's great. So a simple definition would be the methodology of interpreting all things in context of history, or would you put a better spin on that?
I would say it's a hodgepodge of psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, with a lot of linguistics woven through there that looks at the variables around which we as human beings construct and impute meaning to our world. Interpretation theory.
Exactly.
Isn't that just what you said?
It's exactly what I said. So here's John studying in school. He gets knocked on his dorm room door. The three-letter agency, they want to now take this model of thinking into the field. And so can you tell us how you got involved with the agencies, and then maybe tell us about how you took out the number 2 spy?
Well, yeah. I mean, after an MBA in law school, I decided that academia is where I was going to head, and I was working on that PhD. And when, again, the FBI knocked on the door and thought that they needed a hermeneuticist. We had a protracted argument. They were confident that they would weed me out if I wasn't right for the organization. Well, I told them, well, I already know I'm not right for your organization. But we went through the dance anyway. In the end of the day, they handed me a weapon and a badge and sent me out to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, where the application of hermeneutic principles, rightly, I think, could aid us in the anticipation and the prediction and defeat of the next ring of terrorists. And the Joint Terrorism Task Force were just emerging at that time. And even though we very much wanted to be proactively preventative out there, we were pretty much stymied in the world of reactive detection. Very frustrating. We worked Lockerbie after it already happened, the Oklahoma City bombing after it already happened. I chased the Unabomber like everybody else and their dog and never caught him in reactive mode. Very frustrating. And when we moved to cyber, and I went up against one of the first freakers, Dark Dante, we are still stymied in that reactive detective world, trying to catch and stop them after they'd already hurt us. So I'm very frustrated by this world that I see stymied in, and yet that doesn't stop me from persisting. I get eventually, after doing battle with Dark Dante, invited to go in light cover at the CIA, where we had a new problem of we knew he had another spy after Ames. We didn't know who he was. They figured, I guess, my hermeneutic skills might help in anticipating or figuring out who that was, and we actually were successful in identifying him. I watched how he exploited the interdependency between physical and cyber, how it was puzzling to me yet again that after 240 40 years of experience with insiders and spies since the time of George Washington, we as a nation still could only ever play catch-up in going after these guys. And it dawned on me, well, that's a big data problem too. Hermeneutics works its way in there, and it's because we couldn't wrap our arms around all those indicators that these spies were able to go for as long as they did. Fortunately, we saw the advent and the evolution of technologies like big data analytics. Of course, Snowden helped out a lot there, because with the Snowden affair, we got the motivation from the government to come up with an insider threat program by the end of 2016, or we were out of the game. That helped motivate and pull these forces together, and that's where I've been able to leverage it quite effectively in the private sector. But again, only just seeing the sort of like the horizon of a new age where maybe this reactive detection world that we've been stymied in might maybe be giving way to proactive prevention. I mean, true prevention, pre-execution of the harm and the evil. Maybe we're on the dawn of that. I didn't put a lot of time in it because I'd lived my whole life in the reactive detection. I was willing to sit satisfied with that, I guess. But then I started to see these inklings, and then eventually serendipitously one day came across the true strength and prowess of artificial intelligence in the form of silence.
Yeah. So walk us through this. You're working, and you tell your team, go employ this software, go employ this, and let me know when it fails.
Well, backing back a little bit, when I finally was enticed out of government after just 10 years with the Bureau into the private sector, a lot of my peers said, "You're crazy. You're giving up your pension. You're going to go into the private sector where they're always getting compromised. You're going to get fired within a year, or the short life of a CISO. What are you thinking?" I said, "Well, you've got some valid concerns." I remembered one of the principles I learned in MBA was that you under-promise and over-deliver. I said, well, I was already aware of the anemic performance of signature-based antivirus, and that indeed I probably would be compromised. I said, well, I'll manage my leadership's expectations. So I went into their office and I coined this phrase, or it was one of many who probably coined the phrase, that not if, but when. You've heard that? It's almost a mantra now. We all repeat it in the morning, right? When we wake up, not if, but when. I got them to believe that. And so when we were eventually compromised, instead of being summarily fired, we started talking about other things. Mean time to detection, or all these other wonderful things we maybe could have done, but wasn't summarily fired because of that. So it was that dialogue or that discussion that began there, and that was actually a part of every life I had at every company I worked for after going to the private sector. Lucent, Bell Labs, Honeywell, Dell. There wasn't a one when my frenemies didn't pay me a visit. My frenemy, the Chinese. Every single, it's my lot in life that every company I worked for, I had intellectual property with sufficient value that it would entice them to come after me. Of course, having defeated me each time, usually because of the anemic performance of signature-based antivirus, I would sit back and I'd analyze what they did to me, and I would take insights out of that and say, wow, now I know how to apportion these scarce resources I have. So that's where the friend comes in. That's what the frenemy. So I'd use those insights to leverage, hopefully making it more difficult the next time they wanted to compromise me. And this was an ongoing cycle. So when I get to Dell, I'm expecting that to happen again. In fact, I tell the team as soon as I get there, start looking, because we do business in the global marketplace. We have intellectual, we compete against a state-owned enterprise. We have intellectual property worth stealing. If they're not here, they're going to be here. Go look for it. So while they're off looking for it, I'm promising Michael Dell that anything we sell to the outside, I will deploy internally. The team comes back and says, "You're right, John. They're here. We've expelled them. We've got some new lessons learned. Let's manage a plan to move forward." I get that in place. I get my resources. It's all part of that defense in depth structure that I've been building over the years. And I'm ready to go. And I hear our CTO over in the endpoint division had surveyed the global community and actually found a solution when he threw 4,100 instances of 0 days ransomware against this little solution. It killed 99.7% of it. I said, well, that's BS. I've lived with the wounds of an anemic antivirus for 2 decades. Michael Dell's all excited about this. He tries, I think, to buy it, and that doesn't work. He signs an OEM agreement, starts to embed it in everything he sells to the outside world. I promised him that whatever he's doing in that manner, I would deploy internally. And I don't want to do that because I just got compromised by the Chinese. I've got a plan. I've got a roadmap. I've got things to do, important things to do, not to mess around with this BS. So I tell the team, go get this BS solution, take it in the back room and run what the Chinese just defeated us with. And when it fails, let me know, because I'm going to go back to Michael and say, I appreciate your interest, but stand down. I've got better things to do. A couple of days later, and these are the ops guys, you know, the guys who never smile. I never let them have an office above the first floor because it's harder to commit suicide, you know. They come in, they're walking towards me, and they've got these smiles on their face. And I go, wow, this isn't good. And they said, boss, we don't know what to tell you, but if we'd had silence in place, we would not have lost Christmas. We would not yet be building out further this defense in depth, or I call it the expense in depth, because we in the security industrial complex love the revenue that complexity and that depth produces, but that wouldn't be necessary. And it was then that I started this dialogue with the silence team, of course. And of course, that prowess, I didn't really understand it at the time. I've come to appreciate the power and strength of a math model. That got validated quite quickly as I jumped to him because it coincided with the announcement of the OPM breach. Of course, if you've read the congressional report, it lauds and extols the virtue of moving away from signature-based, moving to these math models because of the fact that silence had come in and salvaged the day. If you haven't read that report, that really lays out some clear indications of where we can possibly improve in the government space, particularly as we try and do battle. And one of the best things we could do is try and leave the old paradigm of signatures to the side, moved into the proactive realm where math model-based antivirus allows us to go, and really start leveraging that. Understanding that there are those challenges. I've heard the previous speaker mention of some of those challenges in the community, in the government that we have to overcome. The congressional report talked about a lot of those. Surely we have to overcome those, but I think the first places we could start is just really move quickly to abandon those signature-based and move to these math models. I think it was Verizon had a stat out there a couple of years ago that 90% of all compromises were traceable back to malware. If 90% of the compromises are traced to malware, and we can take a chunk out of that 90% to the tune of 99.7, wow, that's changing the battle space. We may still need a little bit of the EDR, the forensics work, and we have products now that we've created using our AI power that allows you to, sort of a flight recorder, the forensics capability that you might need, but it really just changes the battle space, and that's what I was really excited about.
Wow, guys, John, thank you so much. We've packed a lot into 10 minutes. Are you going to be hanging out for a little bit?
Sure.
Come and introduce yourself to John. He's got fantastic stories, a great perspective on life. John, I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I'm so grateful that you've been here.
Thank you. It's good to be here with all of you. Good luck in your efforts.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you very much. All right, for our last but not least, our final panel of the day is focused on CDM and cloud security. This is an area that's extremely important to a lot of folks in the room, especially those within government agencies, as they continue to look at the different opportunities that exist out there. So what I'd like to do is introduce to the stage. First, I have James Mersall, who is our researchers and staff writer specializing in cybersecurity with GovernmentCIO. James, can you take your seat? Take up there. As well, we'll introduce Jamie Holcomb. Jamie is the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Jamie, thank you. Bo Hauser, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Small Business Administration. And finally, Paul Beckman, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. James, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So as you said, last but not least, I've talked to these three gentlemen. I don't want to undermine all the great material we've heard so far, but I'd say saving the best for last. So really enjoyed talking to the three of you on our calls on Tuesday. I wanted to first talk about the CDM mandate from CISA. I know, Bo, you talked about the pilot program that you ran at SBA along with DHS. Start with you talking about how you implemented the CDM continuous diagnostics and monitoring mandate at SBA. And then from the other two of you, talk about any ways that you've integrated CDM tools into your existing architecture and ways you've enabled other security functions through CDM.
So first of all, we had to get on a modernization track, and we did that a couple of years ago with the arrival of our CIO, Maria Roach. She really established a pretty ambitious modernization initiative for us, and she saw the issues across the agency at the time, which were substantial, and she made it clear that she wasn't interested in incremental change, right? She wasn't going to engage in these problems and try to improve it incrementally. So she wanted to do something completely different. So that ended up helping us tremendously because it meant that we were going to use cloud in a way that we hadn't used it before at the agency. So, fast forward a bit, I arrived, I've been there about 2 years, and it allowed me as the CISO to really reimagine cybersecurity. And the key there was when we were struggling with the enterprise architecture that would account for multiple clouds, on-prem issues, as well as external services, cloud services that we were also using, we realized that the perspective from the cloud simplified a lot of those challenges, because some organizations, they try to take what they've got and what they own and stretch it to cover these new cloud services, and there's a lot of problems there. So we made the conscious decision to make cloud the central part of our cybersecurity. So what that translates into for me now, I'm ingesting over 400 gigs of log data per day from other cloud services, from on-prem assets, and from other things into the cloud, right? 400 gigs per day. And that allows me to centralize that visibility using big data concepts instead of an on-prem structured data model. We do the same thing for our endpoint protection. All of that feeds into the cloud. We have a cloud access security broker, a CASB, that's in the cloud, and that allows us also to aggregate that visibility across the enterprise. And the key here is I'm not running a single virtual machine to do any of that, right? I'm using the native cloud services available from my cloud service provider, so I don't have any virtual host to take care of, no patching, no configuration, no scanning, none of that. So all of that IT management that we struggle with, I don't have to deal with it because my cloud service provider is providing these services. I'm consuming those services, and I can focus on cybersecurity rather than the carrying and feeding of all of that infrastructure from a traditional standpoint.
SBA is one of the innovators in this space. I feel bad for Bo because I can only imagine how many times he has to go on a roadshow explaining to federal CIOs and CISOs what they did. I know we've had you in a couple of times. Very impressed with what SBA did. One of the things that SBA kind of showed us, at least when we're talking about CDM specifically, is that it's not about the tools. It's about the data. It's about the capability. The spirit of CDM was always supposed to be a capability gap filler. Here are the capabilities we think you need on your network. If you don't have it, CDM will come and help you procure and implement those capabilities. And I think here, at least at DHS, we initially got a little bit wrapped around the axle with respect to, trying to insist that these tools were the tools we needed to be able to get that data into the dashboard. And we realized that wasn't actually the best approach, and that we really just forget about the tools. I don't want to talk about any specific technologies. Let's talk about what specific data sets do you need me to generate to feed that dashboard to give me that enterprise visibility. And once we got past that hurdle and actually started talking about the data, it became extremely easy to start really thinking about what that architecture needed to look like.
And just to pull that a little bit, what that meant for us, we did the pilot with DHS. It was a fantastic pilot. DHS is very interested in modernizing CDM, so it was a great interaction and for us and a great engagement. So we aggregated 6 disparate data sets. We had our scan data, we had our network access control data, we had our inventory data, using big data, unstructured, NoSQL cloud services, right? We aggregated 7 different data sources, disparate data sources in 30 days. And if you go to an organization and you say, I need you to combine your scanning data, your vulnerability scanning data, with your configuration management data, it would be an impossible task, right? Different tools, different data structures, different schemas, but using big data, all of those challenges just disappear. So we were not only able to aggregate all that data, but where we had fidelity issues with a single tool, we compensated that by combining multiple data sets together, and then our data fidelity rose as well.
Yeah, the SBA sounds like definitely the promised land. Unfortunately, I'm probably much like the other federal organizations. I'm a laggard in this case. I've been on the job for about 4.5 months, and in my evaluation, we are really protected, and that's because we're very insular. So doing CDM was required. And so phase 1, great. IBM fix it. We got our configurations. We know what's going on. We're using Tenable's Nessus to understand the vulnerabilities. And I got a crackpot staff with a new CISO who's looking at all these great cloud security architectures. And we will go to the cloud, but we're going to do it very, very thoughtfully. And we're going to learn from all the lessons that you're providing. So we're a fast follower, but thank you very much.
So touching on that a little bit, Jamie, I want to start with you. I know Bo touched a little bit about using cloud tools in his agency and Paul as well. But I know on our call on Tuesday, you mentioned that USPTO is the #1 agency in the government for teleworking by percentage of employees. I think you said 70%. So could you talk a little about what efforts your agency and also for Bo and Paul as well, what efforts you've made to secure your cloud systems and enable that sort of telework or remote work and moving beyond on-prem during these modernization efforts?
Oh, sure, yeah. In fact, I was being very conservative. I've since found out that we're 88% telework. That's amazing. So what do? We actually have patent examiners and trademark examiners who work out of their home. We send them a Soho router and a laptop that's configured, and we only trust those items in our network. So we control everything. Now, why is that? Hey, we control the intellectual property of the United States. So we've got to make sure that it's not stolen. So I take that very personally, and I'm very proud of what we have. However, it is old architecture. It is old and stable, and now we got to look out for more what we're going to do in the cloud. We are going to have a hybrid multi-cloud architecture. So all of our new generation stuff, so we can take advantage of those things like AI and patent search, like fraud detection in trademark logos. So we don't allow the Chinese and others to invade our infrastructure and make sure we're protecting our intellectual property.
One of the things that VHS is doing with respect to how we're securing the cloud, we're doing a lot of things. One of the things I guess I would like to speak about is what we're doing with respect to building these pre-defined, pre-accredited, inheritable security control kind of environments, so that when you are migrating a new system and want to bring that new system into the cloud, you can come into that pre-accredited environment with very little lift and very little bureaucratic work, documentation with respect to getting its ATO. Cloud Factory was the first one out of the gate. We've got 2 more initiatives going on. We call them Grace and Cirrus. But yeah, we are just building these general support systems, GSSs, where we are going in there, putting in all the required security controls, documenting, validating, and assessing those, and giving that its ATO, so that when you're coming in a new system, you are literally inheriting about 95% of the security controls are required for that. And there's just that little 5% at the application layer that you would be needing to document and amend to that accreditation package. But that's one of the best things that I'm doing to try to get my arms around all of the components within DHS moving to the cloud. You know, are you moving into a pre-built, pre-accredited system?
And we struggle with the remote worker use case as well at SBA. We have one office that's the Office of Disaster Assistance, and disaster assistance works closely with FEMA. When there is a disaster, they're boots on the ground in those areas, helping small businesses that have been harmed by the floods or the hurricanes or what have you. So we were really busy a couple of summers ago. But you know, that use case is very demanding, and the traditional, you know, VPN from your home kind of model is clumsy when you get into those remote circumstances. So what we're trying to get to next, and we're on the path now, is leveraging the zero trust model. We want folks to get internet access however they can get it. If there's a cell tower or Starbucks or you name it, connect however you can connect, and we're going to build the software onto the system so that the VPN aspect is invisible to the user. They don't have to double click, they don't have to log in, none of that. It's automatic, and it gets them to the cloud edge, right? So any internet connection to the cloud edge. And if you're on a trusted device, right, you have a higher level of trust, so you get more access. If you're on a trusted network, your trust is even higher, and you get more access. And where those things don't exist, your experience is limited. So that's sort of the fundamentals of the zero trust model, the way we're trying to head.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned zero trust. I know a lot of information security leaders in both public and private sector are excited about zero trust, especially what it can do for telework, conditional access to data and critical systems, although some may not fully understand what zero trust means or what it takes to implement. So, Bo, I'm glad you brought that up. Jamie and Paul, could you talk a little about implementing zero trust at your agencies? I know you both mentioned it in our call on Tuesday. So could you talk about that a little bit, and then also any results that zero trust or the implementation of it have yielded for you?
Sure. I have a mission, though, that's counter to that zero trust as well. So I've described already how my teleworkers work, and we only trust them. But I also have a dissemination mission. Everybody needs to know who owns that intellectual property, whether it be the trademark or the patent. So I have a huge dissemination issue where I have to protect that as well to the public, making sure only those authorized to see it. But everybody's allowed to see it, right? Not exactly. And we get people that are preventing others from seeing it. That's one aspect. And so we really have to figure out the public versus private trust issues. So it's pretty easy on the private issues. You secure, you lock it down, and even with the cloud technology, that's great. It's the public side that I'm concerned about, making sure that everyone has good access, and the performance is very important at that point as well. You can't disregard the fact that everybody wants that data. So we're doing things like artificial intelligence, figuring out through a blockchain register who may be the right people to come in and ensuring that we have the performance throughput that we need for dissemination. So I know that goes off a little, but it's a little different on the mission.
So zero trust is a big buzzword these days. I think it's starting to get abused somewhat in the manner in which people describe it. My lead engineer likes to describe it as it's more of a journey than a destination. What I'm out trying to promote and advise is that it's not a solution you can just go out and buy tonight or today and have implemented in the next couple months, and then you've got zero trust. It's not that easy. ACT-IACT put out a very good white paper on zero trust and kind of was laying down the path of things that CIOs and CISOs need to start thinking about now to be able to implement zero trust. And the fact is that what a lot of people may or may not realize is that zero trust, the foundation of zero trust, the technologies that establish the foundation of zero trust are technologies you already have. This is not new technology. You know, I like to say that what's old is new again. These are basic network security principles that have been around for a very long time that you need to be able to establish zero trust. What am I talking about? I'm talking about segmentation, access control, network isolation, compartmentalization. Zero trust starts talking about micro-segmentation. But this is not a new concept. Being able to segment your network and compartmentalize it so that you are reducing the potential attack surface that could get compromised if someone were to get in. 802.1x, mutual authentication. In the world of zero trust, you're going to be authenticating everything. Every time. Anytime you want to print a document, you're authenticating to that printer every single time. You know, that every time we talk about zero trust, it was that concept. Everyone talks about the concept of the crunchy exterior, the squishy interior. Those days are going to be going away. So again, the foundational technologies are things that you already have and can put into place now. You got to do access control. You got to do real least privilege and role-based access control, attribute-based access control. Strong authentication. Again, all technologies that you already have in your tool set, we just need to go back and do the work required to actually do that. Least privilege.
Yeah, and that's a great way to look at it. You know, zero trust in some contexts is a bit confusing. One of the things that we're doing now at SBA, and it's just a simple example to show you, we allow access to email broadly, right? And you've heard the term identity is the new boundary, and that fits with what Paul's saying about thinking of the same tools in a different way. And so if someone authenticates with strong authentication, but they're on their personal device, we allow them to view their email, but they can't download anything, they can't do anything with attachments, you know, and we have very surgical controls of what they're able to do over that session, because the trust level is lower, right? But if they're on their government-furnished equipment and they're on a trusted network, then we give them the full experience. So same tools, same capabilities, just sort of characterized from a different perspective.
I love that you brought that up, Bo, because one of the unique things that zero trust will give us is the distinction between binary trust and variable trust. Binary trust is the traditional, do you know your password or not? Yes, great, you're in. If not, you get rejected. Variable trust, when we start about zero trust and these next-gen firewalls and the capabilities that we're going to get through AI and ML, yeah, we can make decisions based on variables and factors, and then give you a trust score, similar to a credit score, but this is in regards to how much do we trust you, and make decisions based upon that score. So yes, if I just trust you a little bit, I'm gonna put you over here in this enclave. If you start doing something really weird, I'm gonna start monitoring you. If you start doing something really, really weird, then I start blocking you. So this is gonna be different reactions to different levels of trust.
Actually, I want to pull on a thread that Jamie brought up with separating between the public information and the private information. So I think we talked about this a little bit earlier before as well. I'm thinking about SBA, both the internal data and then also working with small businesses, or DHS. I'm thinking about some of the subsections of DHS, whether that's TSA or border security. But what challenges have you found in your agency that relate to separating out public-facing versus internal-facing, and how are you working through that challenge in your security? What solutions have you found, and do you have any success stories to share?
Well, of course, I'm doing it through, as just mentioned, role-based access control. In fact, most folks might not know, but we actually collaborate and cooperate with the other IP offices around the world, and we have instituted and we operate our own network where they all share the IP on that. That's a special network with role-based, and based on the variability of who you are and what you can see, that's how we transmit our IP back and forth and make sure that no one is using other IP that they're not authorized. Now, as far as the private side, though, we've just instituted my USPTO, which is great. Now we're actually we know who's on the site down to the person, the identity. So that's a lot better than we've done before, so we're moving forward. It's all the cloud stuff that I'm concerned about, making sure I don't get my nose bloodied, so.
We'll help you.
All right.
Paul, do you have anything to add on your end? Or?
If I can, let me just paraphrase your question so I make sure that I understand it.
Sure.
What is the difference between how I'm handling internal systems versus external systems?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
So it all boils down to, the cybersecurity framework you have to identify before you start protecting. So it's a matter of identifying the different, regardless of whether it's internal or external, what is the value of the data resident on that system? Is it going to be a high value asset, or is it going to be a public facing system just generating static content out to the general public for informational purposes? So the answer is it depends. But if I find myself with an external system that I am labeling a high value asset, or even more importantly, a mission essential system, then I'm going to be much more aware of the security of that system, the monitoring of that system, the continuous monitoring of that system. So it all boils down to the categorization and the identification stage, knowing what your crown jewels really are, and then defending them appropriately.
One specific capability that's really maturing fast in the cloud is around information protection, building labels and basing policy on labels. And so, we're hoping that that area continues to mature and allows us to really have granular control at a very low level across all of the, cloud services as we go forward.
Wonderful. So I don't think we can have a discussion on cybersecurity without mentioning the 800-pound gorilla, as one of you put it, or I might put it, 800-pound dragon in the room, talking about China and other advanced persistent threats. So how are your agencies mitigating the threat from APTs and foreign intelligence, and what would you recommend other agencies focus on in this regard?
I will always keep coming back, and I keep foot stomping this. This is going to become my mantra. We have got to go back to the basics. When you think about the basics, you will thwart 95% of your threats out there in general, and to include APT. First thing is know your network. Understand what's on your network. You cannot protect what you are not aware of. I often hear when I'm talking to my NSA buddies that these APTs understand your network architecture better than your best network admin. That's because they take the time to do their reconnaissance and do it well. So they really will understand your network almost as good as you. So understand what's on your network. And that's one of the things that CDM Phase 1 understood that was the foundation. What's on your network? Who's on your network? It all starts there. Aside from that, patching, patch management. You cannot exploit a vulnerability that does not exist. Patch. So if you're not, I go on these rants sometimes where, again, going back to the cybersecurity framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And it's a hierarchy to some degree in my mind's eye. It's a chronological order. You got to know what's on your network before you can protect it. You should worry about protecting your network before you start worrying about detecting things on your network. Whenever I get that question, or when I get that thought, if I have another dollar, where am I going to spend it? I'm going to spend it on protection first before I spend it on detection. Have I adequately protected my network, rather than investing in the money required to detect when something goes wrong? I think there's much more. So I'm going to do everything I can to complete that protection stage before I start worrying about investing more dollars in the detection stage. So yeah, all that is to say, the answer to your question is how we deal with APT is going back to the basics. Patch management, again, and what was I saying? Access control, configuration management, least privilege principle, application process whitelisting, reputational services, some foundational network security technologies that will get you 95% of the way.
And I'll just continue that thought. As a CISO, the way I approach cybersecurity from an enterprise program level is using two models. One is defense in depth, like Paul described. You really do defense in depth until the money runs out, right? If it's a castle, you have your moat and you build the wall as high as you can. And then once you are comfortable with that, which you're never really comfortable with it, but you combine that with another model, and that is a threat-based approach. You have to have intel analysts who are tracking the threat actors who are interested in your sector, right? At SBA, we operate like a bank, and we support the small businesses in a financial manner primarily. So our threat model is similar to the financial sector threat model. So where there's a cyber criminal or an APT actor interested in the financial threat financial sector, my cyber threat analysts are tracking that information to understand what their motivations are, and more importantly, how they do what they do, because all of the actors have their favorite tactics that they use, and that intel helps me to be a lot more surgical with my defenses so that I can at least set up tripwires for when certain things happen, and then quickly understand if it's a sophisticated attack by a cyber criminal or APT and adjust accordingly. So we know IT's flawed every day, all day, right? So we start there. So, protection is key, and then having the processes and the resilience in place to really be able to minimize the harm when things do happen.
But I love the whole fact that CDM has this promise: if something's coming at me and I can defend myself, I will. But then reporting it on up and calling for the reserve troops, because I need the intelligence community to know what my attacks are. And I think that's the big promise of CDM, and forwarding all of our attacks up to a higher level so that they can get a better picture. And then we rely on our intelligence community to ensure that we won't get attacked again.
I really like going back to one of the things that Bo was saying. I'm a big fan of these threat modeling, these threat frameworks. It's somewhat of a new shift in thinking with respect to how you analyze an attack. We were big fans of the Lockheed Martin kill chain, where you're really breaking out the chronological steps that an attack phase takes and always trying to get to the left of the attacker. But more recently, I'm getting much more interested in things like the MITRE attack framework, and even better, the OD&I threat-based attack framework. These are things that are looking to understand, to Bo's point, your adversary, understanding what is their objective, what is their resources, what is going to be their motivation for coming at you. And if you find yourself in one of those systems that is going to be a high-value target to one of these guys, then you really got to go through every possible threat that they could provide and what technologies you have in place that would be able to mitigate that threat. And it's really just a holistic, soup-to-nuts way to understand where your gaps are.
And it's a continuous process because the adversary evolves. Every time you think you've got them, they shift their technique, and keeping up is the hard part in that area.
Well, I think we have just a few minutes left, so I want to open up the questions to the audience, see if anyone has any questions for our speakers, and if not, I've got one more. But all right. Oh.
Do you have a question?
From a perspective of insider threat, it's great that people are able to telework. You save a lot of money that way. But how are you galvanizing support on the individual level for people to be better stewards of their own security. If they see a threat or they are like, oh, I was able to do this and I probably shouldn't be able to do this, moving that up the chain and being a part of it, even if they don't work within this department, whether they are just across your agency or your organization. How are you making sure that you're all playing for the same team, so to speak, so that this is a more dynamic conversation throughout the agency on cybersecurity?
So insider threat is a very tough challenge, right? Because you've got folks who have access to the facilities and have access to the IT systems. So they're really at a big advantage if they want to kind of do something nefarious. I think it's an area where zero trust will also help us because, again, your trustworthiness is not only the gear that you have, but the role that you have in the agency and the things that you're supposed to be doing from a job role. And then, so the trust can be, can help, you know, put the guardrails on what you can see and what you don't, because now it comes down to a fundamental IT management challenge where if you switch job roles, did we do everything around that transition to remove your accesses that you used to have and really align to what you have moving forward, which is tough. It's tough to get that granular at every single employee, especially with an organization like DHS. I can't imagine how they would keep up with that. But I feel like zero trust is going to help us, but there's a lot to kind of account for before we got a good answer for that.
And you weren't, I don't know if you were really talking about the nefarious insider threat. You were talking about maybe like the negligent insider that. It's a tough question. I mean, security awareness training is generally what we come back to in response to that. But I'm a cynic to some degree in that I can only trust the human behavior so far, and I can only bring them along so far. So I really I go all in on awareness training. I go all in on trying to raise the level of paranoia to a large degree to our users to make them aware of what they should be looking out for. But that only goes so far. Everything else is put into technology to prevent that human from doing what they were intentionally or not intentionally trying to do. One last point, we're putting a lot of technology dollars into the concept of UAM, user activity monitoring, to where we are truly understanding what the general behavior of that user, that specific user is on a day-to-day basis. And when they deviate from that, it raises some flags for us to take a closer look.
In itself is a breach. By just in the necessity of needing to accomplish their jobs, they needed to breach security protocol by allowing access. And that's something that, you know, happens, I'm sure, in more agencies than just that one. So I'm wondering, does that fall into that same framework and mindset, just like keep retraining? Like these are our expectations, really stick to it? Or how do you track anytime? How do you go in and find those threats?
So it's not going to be from, it's not going to be the user. Again, back to my point of I can't trust the user whether their intentions are good or bad. I have to rely on technology to help me prevent that kind of behavior. You know, a good thing that I hadn't mentioned that might be applicable to this is just something that CIS was up here earlier. They're one of our forefront leaders with respect to cloud and how we're doing cloud security. But they've got a system set up where we're calling it Cloud Monitor. But this is scripts that is going out, looking across all of the configurations of our cloud infrastructure and finding out if it's deviating from that configuration. And if it's deviating from that configuration, it will automatically correct it and put it back to its trusted state. So we've got crawlers going all over every single device, looking over every single connection, comparing it against a known trusted configuration. And if it deviates, it's either turned off or reconfigured back to trusted state. So yeah, I've got to figure out technical solutions to solve those problems and cannot rely on the human behavior to help.
And I would just add, anytime there's a valid business case that is inhibited by security, shame on us as security professionals. We have to do a much better job engaging with the business, being a partner in the business, knowing the business priorities, and really aligning the security the right way. That should never be the case. And, folks say, oh, the policy says X. And, in a lot of those cases, I own the policy. I can rewrite the policy. We can make it work the right way. So the old, legacy culture of security as an authority doesn't help in all of these situations. We really have to be a true partner to the business.
I think we are all out of time, so I'm going to kick things back over to Michael. Before I do want to make a shameless plug. If you have any more questions for us, I know I and the other researchers and writers will be at our tables during the networking period, and I'm sure some of our speakers will be around as well if you want to ask more questions of them too.
All right. Well, thank you very much, James. So that concludes our State of Cyber CXO Tech Forum. Thank you, everybody who joined us today and took part in the conversation. I will say we have 2 more CXO Tech Forums left this year. We have one in December, and then another that will be forthcoming with an announcement in September on RPA. So look out for that. We're excited to be it, and please make sure too that you see all of our different content, whether it be on GovernmentCIOmedia.com, as well as our podcast and videos. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Well Thank you. Well Thank you guys for both.